In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Welcome back to Last Best Constitution. Tonight and today you're going to be watching one of a series of programs that have been put together here on the 50th anniversary of Montana's 1972 Constitution. As some people like to say, Montana's Constitution 50 years young. But we've just concluded a series of meetings to commemorate the Constitution, to elevate the knowledge on the Constitution in terms of its substance, and to recognize those who built the Constitution, the delegates, the research analysts, the staff that helped make it all happen. Back in 1970 era, change was in the winds in Montana. We were looking at changing the Constitution. It was put on the ballot. 65% of the people said we need to look at having a new Constitution because they understood that our old Constitution, adopted in 1889, had a lot of weaknesses in it, and it made governing not very easy in Montana. But more importantly, that 1889 Constitution, which was drafted by the way, all men, delegates at the time, was chaired by the one and only W.A. Clark, the most nefarious of the Butte Copper Kings, and it clearly was written in a manner that provided special privileges, if you will, to the powerful, the economic and the socially and culturally powerful people of Montana, including in the tax area. For example, a lot of people don't realize that the original Constitution said that the proceeds of mining could not be taxed. Try that one on for size. So people were looking for change, and after World War II, and we had people a little more aware when they came back from the military and the war, their eyes were open to bigger cultures and different things, and the GI Bill came through. And so many, by the thousands, Montanans became educated, and they started to look into the dark, deep corners of Montana government and what was happening with it. And they didn't always like what they saw. Because of that, there was a vote held, and 65% of Montanans voted in favor of calling this Constitutional Convention. The lead up to it was interesting. There were two commissions that were created, the Revision Commission and the Constitutional Convention Commission, and people were invested, so it wasn't just a 60-day process. It was a multi-year process with a lot of research and advanced work so that when delegates came in, they could work actively on it. 100 delegates were elected, and they were citizen delegates. As citizen delegates, you couldn't be another elected official. A legislator couldn't be on in the convention. A mayor couldn't be in the city convention. So we had citizen delegates, and I think, in my judgment, that led to the kind of creativity of it and a new look at the way to do things instead of just the way we always did it every 2 years when we met in Helena. So we're recognizing again, and in a way we need to honor those who wrote the Constitution and those that worked behind the scenes with them to research and provide information and assistance to those citizen delegates. And today we have one of those people with us. It's Roger Barber. Roger, welcome to Last Best Constitution.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. Roger was the research analyst for the Revenue and Finance. We're talking taxes here. This is real serious business.
State money.
Yeah. And so welcome. As we get started, I think it's really important for people to understand who you are, where you come from, what brought you to the stage where suddenly you were helping delegates figure out how to deal with those important issues of money in the Constitution. So tell me a little bit about your background and history.
Sure. I'm a native Montanan, lived here all my life except for a year and a half in Washington, D.C. Grew up on a wheat farm in central Montana. Graduate of Denton High School. And it was a good life. I mean, my parents were classic Montanans. My life in Denton, Montana was classic small town Montana. But I didn't like the farm life. And my parents were very much interested in education. Neither one of them had gone to college. They were both from big families, grew up during the Depression, but they really were invested in education, and they told all of their sons, I have 2 other brothers, that college education was part of what they hoped for us. So my older brother and I both happily went off to college. Neither one of us liked the farm at all. And I went to the University of Montana. It was then called Montana State University. I kind of, like many students, knocked around, what do I do? Thought I wanted to be a doctor, but by my sophomore year I knew that was silly. But I was a pretty good writer, so I decided to become a journalism major. And that was my first degree from the University of Montana. I graduated in journalism in 1967. Worked for a small but very well-respected newspaper in Montana called the Western News in Libby. The editorial writer at the time, Paul Verdon, was really respected for his comments, especially on government issues. And many of the subscribers to the Western News were not from Libby or from northwestern Montana. They were from all over Montana because of Paul Verdon's editorials. But I kind of also realized that I probably should go to graduate school, but I wasn't really sure that a journalism graduate degree would get me anywhere.
What'll that get you?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't really see where it would get me, except maybe to be a college professor, which at the time I hadn't really thought about. So, but I looked around and thought, well, maybe law school, because at the time there were a lot of interesting controversies between the press and the courts. For one thing, what does it mean to be a public figure? There were lots of public figures who'd sued for slander, and they lost. And the reason was that they had put themselves in the public limelight, and therefore comment about their lives was fair. So there were lots of interesting controversies like that between journalism and the press and the law. I thought, well, I'll go to law school. Why not? I'm single, don't have any debt, maybe. Well, I got into law school, and while I liked the subject matter, I quickly realized I wouldn't be a good lawyer because I don't like conflict. And I mean, honestly, you think I would have been more realistic about my career choice, but I did like the discipline. I liked the subject matter. I liked the way of thinking. I liked the logic involved with the study of law. So I stuck with it. And graduated.
What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 1971. And that's kind of key. That's kind of key to why I'm here today, Evan, because while I didn't realize it in the early years of law school, when you're in law school, you just kind of live the law school life. You just immerse yourself in trying to get through and hang on and be sane. But one of my jobs in law school, was that I worked as a work study student for the Public Information Office at the University of Montana.
And you could write well.
And I was a journalism major. I obviously could use a little extra money. But one day my boss in the Public Information Office said, Roger, go out on the campus and just stick your nose in offices and find out what's going on in campus. Find some kind of human interest, public interest things that we could write about and kind of use to advertise the University of Montana. So I did that. I just began to wander around campus, and probably the third or fourth door I stuck my nose in, there sat Dale Harris, all by himself, very small office. And I knew Dale because we were in the same class in undergraduate school. We had been in some service clubs together and stuff. So we were friends. And I said, Dale, what are you doing? And he told me, I'm working for the Preparatory Commission that's getting ready for Montana's Constitutional Convention. So I wrote an article about it. I wrote about this one-person operation that was getting ready for this historic event. But I also thought, this could be a lot of fun. This is something that is very unusual in a state's history, except, by the way, if you're from a southern state. Some southern states have had 10 and 12 state constitutions.
They do it willy-nilly,
Yeah, really.
Well, and of course I want to just say that Dale Harris, who regretfully passed away a number of years ago but at a very young age,
yes.
We did a nice program about him, referring to him, I think appropriately, as the godfather
Absolutely.
of the Constitution.
Absolutely. Anyway, as I said, Evan, I thought, well, this could be really fascinating to work for the convention. So I literally did not look for another job when I graduated from law school. No surprise, I didn't particularly want to be a lawyer, but there are lots of things you can do with a law degree. So I contacted Dale. He told me how to apply for one of the research analyst jobs. He had already hired a number of analysts. I graduated in June. Some of the analysts were already on the job. They'd been there for 2 or 3 or 4 months before I graduated. But he told me that there were a couple of other research positions open. Send in my name. So I did. I made the unfortunate mistake about 2 weeks after I sent in my application to tell one of my very best friends at the law school that I had done this, Sandy Mucklestad. She just asked me in passing, what are you going to do when you graduate, Roger? And I said, well, I don't know, Sandy, except that I'm kind of taking a one-shot approach here and I've applied for the Constitutional Convention. Well, that sounds fascinating, she said. And she sent in her application and they hired her first because her grades were better. I think I may have literally, talked myself out of a job, but Dale was kind enough to hire me. I'm not quite sure he had the money for another researcher, but he hired me to be the analyst on the Research and Finance Committee. And that's how I started working for the Preparatory Commission.
And the Prep Commission, the sequence was that once they passed it in November of '70 that we're going to have a constitutional convention, the '71 legislature created a commission to move it forward, and there were scheduled elections in September and November and special elections for the delegates, and right in the middle of that thing you were getting yourself put on, so that's where the research would take place on that, so that it would be ready for the delegates when they showed up.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were asked to literally prepare a very comprehensive document about issues affecting revenue and finance in a constitution.
Essentially, you guys wrote a book on.
That's exactly right. maybe sometimes a too wordy book, but yes, we wrote a book about the issues. Absolutely. So I spent basically from June until November. I think my study was published in November, literally researching issues about revenue and finance from a state constitutional perspective.
And in the end of November, after the 100 had been elected, there were 58 Democrats and there was 36 Republicans and 6 independents. They did meet and select their leadership.
Yes.
And that was the first meeting at which they sat alphabetically, which most of those delegates credit with helping them to learn how to work with each other and not become partisan soldiers. And they say it would make a big difference in what they ended up with as a final product. You have an opinion on that?
Oh, absolutely. It was key. It was vital. It was so brilliant. I mean, interestingly enough, it's just a little side, Evan, but it's the one part of the convention that I got to watch most most extensively was that meeting in November when they organized themselves, because Dale Harris asked me to be sergeant at arms. So I literally stood at the back door and opened and closed it over and over again. But I got to watch them put themselves together. And it was brilliant in just in so many ways. I mean, if you think about the impact that could have on legislative bodies now, how it could heal so many of the problems we have now with legislative bodies. It's remarkable that they literally sat there as equal delegates, set aside as much as they could their party designation, even though they were elected under the party system, got to know the people that they sat next to and in front of and behind, talked to them during breaks, organized their committees on as much of a nonpartisan basis as possible.
There was shared power on the leadership of the committees.
And absolutely. I mean, even though the Republicans were the so-called minority party at the convention, my committee chair, Sterling Rigg from Kalispell, was a Republican, and his vice chair, Maurice Driscoll, was a Democrat from Butte. And the membership, obviously, was also dispersed among parties, which happens now with committees. But there was no kind of specific attempt to weigh the committees so there were as many Democrats as there were in the body of the whole, and as many Republicans as there were in the body of the whole. They literally tried to put together the best committee they could, obviously from the delegates.
And like you say, one wonders what the impact would be both at the state legislative level and at the congressional level if folks were seated alphabetically and not able to divide.
Absolutely.
Like the parting of the Red Sea.
Which is so obvious.
You're on one side and you're on the other.
Which is so obvious when you walk down that aisle. There's a divide here. That's only a few feet wide but seems insurmountable.
Now, when you're now assigned to Revenue and Finance back in June, and you're starting from scratch, I'm sure there were some other states' constitutions sections were there for you, but research was really different then. You didn't have an internet, you didn't have a Google, interlibrary loan. It took a long time to gather materials.
Yes.
Tell me about the difficulty of getting the materials, and tell me about how you would approach encapsulating revenue ideas. You know, how do you figure out how to package that?
Sure. And obviously, it was all basically written materials. We were lucky in that we were in the state capitol, and the law library was in the same building at that time, just across the corridors.
And Catherine Orchard was nice to you.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And by this, worth noting that we not only didn't have the internet, there wasn't even fax machines back then. Yeah.
So I mean, blessedly, we had the law library, the state law library, right across the building, and because I'd gone to law school, I knew how to research in a law library. Dale, I mean, again, honestly, Dale Harris was the godfather. He had collected mounds of materials for all the research analysts on their particular subject. Most of them were national publications from good government organizations. Organizations that are interested in kind of the ideal constitution, what sorts of things work, philosophical articles about constitutional concepts. And yes, we had access to other state constitutions. There was a small movement in the early 70s for constitutional conventions in other states. So we had the experience of what was going on in other states, though none of them, to my knowledge, kind of mounted the same research effort that Montana did. So basically, it was all and law review articles. Again, that was a source of access, and the law library could help you find those things. So primarily, it was all written materials, trying to focus in on articles affecting your particular topic. And in some ways, my research, while I ended up with a big book, a big topic for the delegates to read, my research was fairly simple because over and over again, I've discovered in reading especially the kind of learned model constitutional documents that the less said in a state constitution about taxation and revenue, the better for the state. And I can talk a little bit about that as we get into it. But ultimately, the document I prepared did focus on the specific articles that were in the old statehood constitution and what was good or bad about them. But also I talked about other things that the delegates and the committee could consider as they craft an article dealing with revenue and finance. And over again, I would kind of conclude by saying maybe doing nothing, maybe not doing this is the best way forward for the future. So my document is kind of a naysayer document in some ways.
Maybe we don't need to do this.
That's exactly right.
Less is more.
That's exactly right.
Well, in fact, in essence, that seems appropriate for you as a good writer, because the art form of writing, they often say, the editors will say, you know, if you can say it in 600 words, it'll probably be a lot better at 400 words.
Yeah, right.
Or in the case of a constitution, it might be better at 40 words.
That's exactly right.
So you had to have already learned brevity in writing as in your journalism.
It helped a lot. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well,
absolutely.
That's great. So you were sergeant at arms, but how did you first find out? Oh, here's my chairman of my committee, and here's my vice chairman, and what are we going to do? Tell me.
Well, actually, we didn't really. I mean, we knew who our committee members were, but we didn't really have a lot of contact with them until the convention itself convened in January. I mean, they received our materials, they received our study documents, but I cannot remember any kind of preparation or introduction to the delegates of the full committee until they convened in January.
Did Sterling Rigg just show up at the convention and then you started interfacing?
That's right. Yeah.
You know, he had been on the Executive Reorganization Commission.
Sure.
I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know that, no.
And I worked for that commission. That was
Okay.
my first thing in state government, was to reorganize the Montana Executive, and Sterling Rigg was on that, and then he decided not to run again, and he had to be replaced. Matt Himsel replaced him on it, but by not running, he was magically allowed to run for the Constitutional Convention, and all his fellow legislators were shut out from that. So it was that's how you got Sterling Rigg in there.
Right.
So you're sitting down and starting to go to work. The taxes, of course, are what people get really engaged in government. When you have to reach into your pocket and write a check out, or be worried about what are my taxes going to be, people get very interested. So there were a lot of deficiencies in the tax structure in the old Constitution. Can you dive into, say in the property tax area, what were the challenges, the changes that maybe needed to be made?
Yeah, maybe if I could, Evan, I could talk a little bit about kind of, again, that constitutional philosophy, that theory that I discovered, because it kind of sets the tone, I think, for what the Revenue and Finance Committee ended up doing. As I said earlier, my study document kind of said over and over again, you know, think before you do this. Maybe you shouldn't do this. And if you really approach a revenue and finance article in a state constitution from a purely theoretical perspective, the best thing to do probably is to do as little as possible. In fact, the committee had at least 2 witnesses who appeared before them and said, don't do anything. Literally, do not do anything. And I suspect that probably is the only committee at the convention where any witness made that suggestion. And the reason for that is because states have the inherent power to tax, to raise revenue, and to spend public monies. So anything you say in a state constitution either is redundant, you're already restating a power that the state already has, or you're limiting what the state can do in the future. So that's why these people suggested that the Revenue and Finance Committee do nothing. I can't remember who they were. They probably were university professors, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, the committee obviously did something. I mean, they did propose a revenue and finance article. And one thing that's interesting, I mean, not a hidden fact, but the old Constitution had 3 different articles dealing with taxation and finance, 43 different sections. And the ultimate article that was submitted by the Revenue and Finance Committee had 14 sections. So obviously they took a massive, complicated, old document and reduced it significantly, kind of based on the idea, do as little as possible, so you don't inhibit the powers of state government in the future.
Well, there's another pragmatic reason for that too, because complexity provides the opportunity for people who have good accountants and power and money to find ways around things.
Sure.
So complexity is maybe the enemy of fairness.
Sure.
And so if you want to make sure you provide real openness and stuff, you
Absolutely.
eliminate complexity. You guys dropped 29 sections then.
Yes. Yes, and if you compare the Revenue and Finance article, which should have been as modest as possible, it really is about the same size as other articles. If you look at the legislative article, the judicial article, they're about 14 sections, so it is about the same size. But obviously, if you look at what was there before, what was in the old Constitution, it's a significant pruning of and a significant kind of liberation of inherent powers that states need to operate.
Yeah, and you're right about it being inherent. Well, back to the property tax thing.
Sure.
Because I've heard a lot of anecdotal discussion about
Sure.
what the abuses were when the property
Sure.
tax was dependent where in the state you lived.
Sure.
And among other things, since the appraisal of your property was up to a local official who might be way different how they approached it in each corner of the
Sure.
state. Tell me how that works.
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing the committee did decide to do is that they could do some things to make government better. And if you look at the article, there are some good things in there. For instance, it requires a balanced budget. It requires the state live within its means. It requires that appropriation bills are clearly worded and have a single purpose, so you know what it's for. And one thing they decided they could correct is the very, very outdated property tax assessment appraisal system that existed in Montana. It was done at the local level. The legislature itself had done one very comprehensive study about how that system worked, and it identified kind of a dysfunctional system. I mean, you could own a piece of property in 2 counties, and they literally were assessed and taxed at different levels simply because they were in 2 different counties. They were on a county line. You could find property that was almost identical within a county, and it was taxed differently. So the system simply didn't work because there wasn't equity built in the system. It wasn't even an expectation of equity. I mean, yesterday during that celebration, one of the panelists told this story about how Anaconda Company used to have its taxes assessed in Silver County. This is, again, it's based on anecdotal evidence, but from pretty good sources, that Anaconda Company, you just used to go in and tell the local appraiser, this is what we'll pay. And when Anaconda Company sold its properties to ARCO, they said, this is how you do it. So ARCO went in and said, this is what we'll pay. Well, unfortunately, for ARCO, the Constitution had been adopted and there was a whole new system. Taxes were determined at the state level. And the local assessors said, well, it doesn't work that way anymore. I mean, this is how it works. So.
We'd call that a rude awakening.
A rude awakening, yes. So if there was something in the Revenue and Finance article, Evan, that was considered significant and maybe even revolutionary, it was that change from a local property assessment and appraisal system to a statewide system to ensure equity. And it was controversial. Long debates on the convention floor about this. Is this the way we want to go? Significant opposition from interest groups in the state. There was fear that it might doom the new Constitution when it was submitted to the voters. But I, if you talk to the people who work with the system, if you kind of listen to yesterday's panel, Republican legislators, former state revenue directors, all of them stood up and said, this was one of the great things that the convention did, was literally to improve that system. In fact, a former Senator, Tom Towse, stood up at the celebration in Helena yesterday and said, I consider this the greatest achievement in the Constitution, in the new Constitution, was literally to ensure that property is valued and taxed equitably across the state.
Across the entire state.
Yes.
A good kind of example of what we're talking about first is within a county even, if you might be the neighbor of the assessor and have a good relationship
Yes.
with them, you just might get a favorably low assessment on your house.
Or a family member.
Yeah. And the other one, which I thought it was just imagining it, that if you had a ranch that covered 3 counties,
Yes.
which it could, and when they came out to assess the cattle, the Carbon County assessor comes out to assess the cattle, and they're all over on the Stillwater County side.
Yep.
And then when the Stillwater assessor came out, they were all on the Carbon County side, and a lot of times they were never assessed.
Yes.
But that's stories I'd heard many
Yes.
years ago.
And that's what that study revealed that the Legislative Council had put together. Just incredible kind of anecdotal horror stories about how the system worked.
And of course, everybody then looks and says, well, somebody's getting a special favor on this, and it's not me.
Yeah,
You know,
that's right.
What's that old thing? Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree.
That's right.
You know?
Well, the only good tax is one that somebody else pays.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So the Property Tax Central Administration was revolutionary. It
Yes.
really has made a big difference in Montana government.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And
I mean, coincidentally, it's in his address, his recorded address to the convention, current Governor Negan Forte, that's one thing he mentioned.
Specifically.
Specifically.
Yeah.
That and the balanced budget
Yeah,
provision.
yeah. Now, the appeals process, there was a lot of interest in local control, though, which was, again, the fear that maybe it might get beat for some of this stuff. There was appeals issues that came up that involved local control and so on. Can you address? I mean, ultimately they opted to go for the state level stuff, but discuss that.
Yeah, that was part of the concern. Part of the discussion was, should we turn this over to the state? Because there is always, even now, fear of giving states such significant control, and you feel like if you can keep it local, you can keep it personal, it'll be a better system, and often that is the case. So there was significant discussion with the committee of the whole when the whole convention met on this article. Significant concern about creating a state appeals process where if you didn't like your assessed value, if you didn't like the taxes you were be expected to pay, that there was an appeals process, but it was going to be decided by the state. So I think the delegates compromised, and they agreed that a process could begin at the local level. But they did stick with the idea of an impartial, neutral, statewide appeals body that would ultimately determine the tax.
Now that now is called the State Tax Appeals Board,
Yes.
which, given that it's about taxes, it appropriately, the acronym says STAB.
Yeah, yeah.
But before you can go to the STAB, you have to go through an appeals process that is local.
Yes.
So so you've got to have been rejected locally for you to go on upstairs to.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, that's a human concern.
Sure,
kind of,
absolutely.
so
And I think it shows kind of the human nature and the compromise that the delegates were willing to kind of reach as they worked with each other and listened to each other.
Now, there is a section in about the exemption of taxes that when you start talking about saying you could not have to pay it and other people have to pay it, exemption is a sensitive issue. How did that play out?
Yeah, the article that the committee recommended and was ultimately adopted by the convention did have an exception, did have a section that exempted certain property from taxation. And most of the exemptions are kind of historic, and people buy into them. Government property, hospitals, churches, nonprofit organizations, schools. I mean, those are traditional, common exemptions from property tax. And there really wasn't a lot of discussion about that. But that particular section had a subsection which said that the legislature could also exempt other classes of property. So it gave the legislature kind of carte blanche to literally in the future exempt other classes if they wanted to. And there was great concern about that. Was this giving the legislature too much authority, too much power? Should we specify the kinds of classes that the legislature could consider, didn't have to, but could look at? Should we be more specific, or are we granting the legislature too much authority? And there was a minority report filed by a couple of the committee delegates on that particular article, arguing that there be more specificity or some limitation placed on the legislature with that grant of authority. Again, a long, extensive debate about how to balance kind of the freedom you want to give the legislature in its taxing authority, its ability to raise taxes, the freedom you want to give local governments in raising revenue for its operations, versus giving them too much freedom, too much authority. And they ultimately voted to leave it as it was, giving the legislature authority to exempt other classes of property in the future, should they want to, without any kind of specificity or limitation.
And I know among some revenue folks, they feel that's maybe a weakness of the Constitution.
They do,
because
yes.
there have been certain interesting, if you can curry favor with the legislature, suddenly your class of property isn't just got a low rate, it might have an exemption completely.
Have no
and
rate.
There's
right.
some of that going on.
Sure.
But you know, Montana's got a rather remarkable document, but it's not perfect.
That's right. That's right.
Let's talk a bit about the investment of public funds, because this is a revenue. It's not just it's finance as well as revenue, and you know, a big bugaboo with Forrest Anderson when he came into office being elected in 1968. Was he'd been around for a lot of years. He'd been a Supreme Court justice. He'd been a 12-year attorney general, legislator, county attorney. He was really experienced and savvy, knew what was going on. And he kind of observed that the state treasury of Montana was having its revenues stored in banks, who would then take that revenue and lend it out at an interest rate, but they didn't pay an interest to the state. And so hidden in the reorganization bill back in '71 was essentially the seeds of this unified investment process where this money would be gathered together, and you couldn't bounce it off where some favorite banker you knew was getting a better deal than somebody else, which was kind of the old system.
Sure.
So let's talk about that.
And again, there's a very extensive article talking about investment of state funds, retirement funds, school funds. And I suspect that probably the reason for the extensive article was the interest in better government that was occurring at that time, and Governor Anderson, who was the governor at the time of the convention, his concern for the way state monies were being handled. So there's a very extensive and significant article that talks about how state funds should be invested professionally on an actuarially sound basis, conservatively. They should be audited every year. Just sound fiscal fiduciary expectations with the investment of state funds. And there also are some limitations on the kinds of investments that could be made with state funds. Some funds cannot be invested in corporate stock. Some can. But again, the expectation simply was to professionalize the investment of state funds in all their aspects: pension funds, school funds, public land funds, all that money. So it provides a good return for Montana citizens, a careful professional return.
And so this unified investment thing, which is now centralized under what's called the Board of Investments, does just that.
Exactly.
And it is, I would be safe to say that over this period of time, trillions of dollars have been generated for the
Sure.
state of Montana.
Sure.
And when you gain off the money you have to tax less to run government.
Absolutely.
And so it's an amazing, wise fiscal decision that the Constitutional Convention did. Now, let me ask you about some things that have happened in the tax arena that have happened by virtue of amendment, because one of the things that happened in the Constitutional Convention was the change from the old Constitution was a change of the way constitutional amendments could be adopted. Under the old Constitution, you could not amend the Constitution unless the legislature created an amendment and passed it through, and then you could vote on it. And in the new Constitution, 72, in a different section of the Constitution, a different article, allowed people by initiative to institute a suggested amendment, pass it to the electorate. If it passed, it would go into the Constitution. So that was a enabling of the power of the people.
Exactly.
But what comes with that is you got to deal with what they come up with.
What you get.
You know,
That's
maybe kind of a double-edged sword.
That's right.
Talk about some things that happened in the revenue and finance.
Sure. Again, the original Revenue and Finance article, it was adopted by the convention, really didn't place any significant limitations on the taxation power of the legislature. But by amendment, there have been two limitations. One of them places the limit on the amount of sales tax that the state could collect, though we don't have a sales tax. There is a limitation in the Revenue and Finance article. It was added by amendment, and that amendment came from the legislature. That was a legislatively initiated amendment adopted then by the people. And then there also is another limitation which was prepared through the citizen initiative process that you described, Evan, where groups, citizens, interest groups can collect signatures. If they collect enough signatures of the right variety, then they can submit an amendment to the people, and the people can choose to either accept or reject it. And that particular limitation prohibits any kind of tax on what's called a real estate transfer tax. Mm-hmm. So there have been two amendments to the Revenue and Finance article that do limit certain taxation powers of the legislature. And currently there is another. Signatures are being gathered to literally limit how property can be appraised. And it's done primarily as an effort to try and control a significant increase in some real estate in the state. And it's a fairly simplistic approach to how real estate should be appraised. It limits how much the appraisal can increase. Mm-hmm. But again, it was done through the citizens initiative process. Signatures are being gathered. To the best of my knowledge, we don't know if enough or the right kind have been gathered because they have to be spread throughout the different legislative districts. But it could be submitted to the voters in November. Mm-hmm. It's a controversial limitation. Many groups, conservative and liberal, conservative interest groups, legislators from both parties are very concerned about this initiative because it takes a very complicated process and simplifies it significantly.
Well, that's intriguing. And of course, you have a responsibility for a balanced budget. Doesn't automatically deal predominantly with collect less. It's to balance. And if you can't collect money, you can't expend money. And there are requirements of equity in government that we have to have money to spend as well. It's a overly simplistic thing to play politics with taxes. Anytime you can say something that says, I'm going to make sure you don't get taxed anymore.
Yep.
That's a politically popular thing to try to do.
I mean, I think many of the delegates will tell you that if they made a mistake in the Constitution, it may have been to make the citizen initiative process too easy, too simple, because you can get interest groups who collect the right number of signatures, hire a PR firm, come up with some snappy phrases, and they can sell an idea. I mean, the ideas are good, but some of them can be bad. But if you simplify them, it can be rough. I mean, legislators on both parties will tell you that if you limit tax collection on one group, you simply shift it to another, especially in the property tax area. So if private real estate is limited, then you shift that burden to agriculture, to business. Many governments, local governments especially, rely on property tax for their operations. School districts, if they're going to operate, they need to get that money from somewhere. So you simply shift the burden to somebody else.
There's some substantial opposition, like you say, in terms of groups, including pro-business groups, which normally would say a little less taxes is okay with us.
Absolutely.
But they understand that if you take taxes off of houses just to placate and play politics with the homeowners of Montana, it gets shifted over to business taxes and agricultural and so on.
Absolutely.
So there's a cadre of pretty strong organizations opposing this current one.
Absolutely.
I think it was under challenge in the courts, but is that finalized? I think they let them proceed with the initiative
I think
while it's still under challenge.
I think that may be right. They're letting them proceed with the signature collection process.
Yeah. So we'll have to see if it makes the ballot, but there's a lot of opposition to it, which is, again, the kind of thing that...
Absolutely.
Now, the Realty Transfer Tax really interests me.
Yes.
Because there you've got a case where just realtors, people who sell property, don't want there to be a tax on it because it might, in their mind, it would make it harder to sell a house because there might be a 1% tax on it. And if there was, it'd be uniform, of course, across the entire state. But it was inside a group. Their collective group thinking was, oh, this is the most terrible thing in the world. It'll affect your revenue, your commission. And so they put it together and they put it on the ballot. And if you look at it, somebody says, well, it's a tax. I guess I'm against a tax.
Sure.
And next thing you know, we have a prohibition on it.
Sure.
And one of the things it does do is it reduces the reporting that sometimes it comes with the sale of property, which has to do with the value of it. Now, anyway, it seems kind of silly. Now, speaking of the initiative process, we have an example in the Constitution called Marcy's Law.
Yes.
Now, it's nothing to do with revenue, but it's worth noting, and we talk about the initiative process. There was a group, and it was a kind of a cause that made sense. People who are victims of crime should be compensated for the crimes. And some guy in California was super rich, made that his cause to get every state in the union to have a provision that said if certain things happen, people be compensated for that. And it was called Marcy's Law,
Yes.
not Marcy's Amendment.
Yes.
Marcy's Law, and it's this huge thing.
Immense.
And it was hard to articulate against it, and he had $1 million to put up on it, and we were a cheap date apparently when it came to politics.
Yes.
Next thing you know, we have that in our Constitution.
Yes.
It's a little weird. That's all.
Yes, it is. It surely is.
The political process. So we have that, the sales tax. Are there any other elements of this that you as a practitioner, as someone who crafted the philosophy behind this thing, that you think you can think about that you'd like to reference in the revenue side?
I don't think so, Evan. It is a good article. Yesterday, one of the speakers, the former director of the Department of Revenue, was on the panel, literally said unequivocally, in my mind, it is the best revenue and finance article in any state constitution.
Yeah.
And he's had experience with other state constitutions. Yeah, I mean, it is a good article, even though the initial message from me was do as little as possible.
Yeah.
It did some very good things because it made government better, and that's one thing obviously a constitution can do. And it also added some limitations, which are good. You know, a balanced budget is a good thing for a state.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've had a good discussion. Could it have been better? I'm not sure I know ways that it could have been better.
Did it, if you think other than property taxes, income taxes are the primary source of revenue for the state. Was there any controversy in how you approached that, or was it just pretty straightforward? We know we have to have income taxes, so. Yeah,
there honestly wasn't. In fact, I really can't remember any discussion in the committee where they talked about should we limit the state's ability to collect taxes in any form, in any way. No, that seems too specific. Let's kind of abide by the thought this is a document for the future. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what the best tax system will be in the future. There may be new kinds of taxes that people come up with, and Montana should be able to think about that and to adopt what works for it. So I can't honestly, Evan, think of any kind of discussion like that in the committee. They really looked at the article as something that needs to have a long future life.
You know, I've always been, from the time I was cutting my teeth politically in Montana, in 1971, in fact, was fighting against a general sales tax because of its inherent regressivity. And so I've always been an opponent of sales taxes, and you'd think I would take some joy out of the fact that if we ever had a sales tax, it couldn't get above 4% because it's 9.5% in Seattle, and where is it everywhere else, and it always goes up. So, but I don't take any particular joy that limitation is in there, because I would hope we wouldn't have a sales tax. But gosh, again, I think we have to respect the nature of the Constitution.
Sure.
At least that's where I come from. But,
sure. Well, and I live in a community in Montana, Evan, Whitefish, that has a local sales tax. You can have
the resort tax.
The resort tax, absolutely. I mean, and it makes sense in a community like I live in, because
they have infrastructural needs because of tourism.
We are a very popular tourist destination. People come there for the beauty of the area, for the ski hill, for the recreational opportunities in the summer, for the lakes, for the glacier park. I mean, Whitefish is inundated with tourists, and the local people cannot provide the kind of infrastructure they need to take on that kind of onslaught. The population of Whitefish often triples in the summer. So there is in Montana a sales tax of a sort, a resort tax, and many resort communities have adopted it. Columbia Falls, which is basically a blue-collar community, I mean, known for logging and the aluminum plant for years, adopted a resort tax last fall because
I'm from Red Lodge.
Yeah, exactly. Because of the impact of visitors. I mean, visitors can help pay for that infrastructure. So every time I get a receipt from a Whitefish business, most of it is not taxed. But at the very bottom, it shows me what resort tax I paid, because I bought something that wasn't exempt, like liquor or a magazine or something.
Now let's talk a little bit about how as it concluded, a little bit about what you emerged from the Constitution with, and how you proceeded in your career. But when you left the Constitution, I think you maybe picked up something special along the way.
Absolutely. In fact, the Constitution had an immediate impact on my next career move. When I was at the convention, one of the research analysts was a fellow named Bruce Sievers. He was hired late. He was hired actually right before the convention convened to write a study document about education issues, but he was an incredibly talented man. And Bruce and I became friends, and I discovered that he had just a year or two before completed a year-long position as Senator Lee Metcalf's Montana intern.
Yeah.
At that time, Lee Metcalf, Senator Metcalf, the junior senator from Montana, along with Mike Mansfield, the senior senator.
One of my heroes.
Yes.
Yes.
Mine too, absolutely. He had a program where he brought a young professional back to his office for a year-long internship, treated them as one of his professional staff. His expectation was that they would kind of immerse themselves and learn about the federal government and then go back to Montana to kind of educate people and talk about the experience. So he treated them as one of his permanent professional staff members, and he did that for years. Anyway, I found out about this internship. It intrigued me, it sounded interesting, so I applied for it, and the convention delegates really helped me get the position. Many of them wrote me wonderful letters of reference. They didn't know me except for my experience at the convention.
At that time, one of those delegates had been a Metcalf intern, which was Jerry Cate.
That's exactly right. I forgot that. Yeah.
And then after you, Jim Grady.
Well, actually, I got the position, and the convention kind of became this trail of Metcalf interns.
Right.
Rich Bechtel became a Metcalf intern after me, and Jim Grady became a Metcalf intern. So 4 of the research analysts who worked for the convention were also Metcalf interns.
Yeah.
And a wonderful experience. Mary and I had never lived outside Montana, and we returned as soon as we could, but it was a great year to be there. It was the Watergate year.
What's this Mary thing?
Oh, I guess I do need to talk about Mary. One of the most significant things that happened to me at the convention was that I met my wife, Mary Van Buskirk. Her mother was a convention delegate. She was elected from the Havre area. She represented 4 counties, Hill, Judith Basin, Choteau, and Liberty, because Montana had multi-member districts at that time. And Mary quit school to become her mother's campaign manager. In fact, Mary was significant in convincing her mother to run as a delegate because her mother had been active in the League of Women Voters for years and knew a lot about the Constitution. So anyway, Edith got elected. Mary followed her to the convention just because she was interested in what was going on, and that's where I met Mary. And 50 years later, the convention's celebrating its 50th anniversary, and in August, Mary and I will.
Well, that'll be great. Now we're going to have to wrap up quickly, so
Sure.
Very quickly, you went into higher education.
I did. I took a job in teaching at the University of Montana to pay for our way when I went to law school. When Mary graduated from law school, she took a job in Havre with a very well-known law firm. I moved with her without a job, was hired eventually by Montana State University Northern, then Northern Montana College. Professor there for a long time, an administrator, worked at Northern for 28 years, moved into administration, was provost at Northern, which is the academic officer, the kind of the number 2, and then ended up working for the Office of the Commissioner of Higher Education as a deputy commissioner.
So you were deputy commissioner, and that was your final public role.
That was my swan song.
Yeah.
I worked as deputy commissioner of higher education for the state of Montana for 5 years. Yeah. Fabulous job.
Yeah, well, I knew you back then too.
Absolutely, you were working for Governor Schweitzer, absolutely, as his economic advisor.
And Montana is a small town with really long streets.
Absolutely.
And we all know each other.
Aren't we
it's
lucky?
a wonderful thing to be able to
Aren't
do
we
that.
lucky?
And you have had a remarkable career.
Yes, I have.
Working on behalf of the people, and that's got to be quite fulfilling.
It is.
And a key component of that career that you can always look back on, your kids and your grandkids can look at, is they can say that, my dad, my grandfather helped write this Constitution, which is arguably the best Constitution in the nation. I think, in fact, it is cited in some textbooks as being one of the best constitutional documents ever written.
Yes.
By some academics. So, well, thank you for taking the time to sit down with us here on Last Best Constitution. It's just such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Evan.
And For the audience, we hope you've enjoyed this program. We hope that you'll tune in to our next Last Best Constitution and learn more about this wonderful document. Thank you.